Cops of Reddit, what's the creepiest thing you found during a house search? I was a fresh officer with the dreams of being a hero. I get dispatched to a call of a family fight. Not wife-husband, but brother-sister. The female was reporting the male had attacked her. I arrived and located a female and male. The male I knew from prior contacts. I detained him in handcuffs and quickly smelled the strong odor of pepper spray. I found out that after the male knocked off the female's weave, she pepper sprayed him. I knew there were different types of pepper spray, like gel. I'm walking around the house taking photos for my investigation and assessing the property damage. I noticed that in his room the odor from the pepper spray was extremely strong and made my eyes instantly water with a decent amount of stinging sensation. The fumes made it incredibly hard to breathe, and left me without the ability to breathe at points, requiring that I leave the room to get fresh air. I find a brownish gel substance all over the walls in the shape of handprints. I photographed it and determined that it was the pepper gel the male suspect was wiping off his face onto the wall. I found it odd that it was all over the walls and covered the room. I thought this chick dusted him with the entire can of pepper gel. After some investigation, I took the male to jail. I responded to the same house several days after for an unrelated medical issue. There were more family members at the house and the male was still in custody. I was having a conversation with the family as the hero firefighters were saving the day. I inquired if they had fully cleaned up the pepper spray from the male's room. They gave me a strange look and told me there wasn't any in there. I told them about the gel that was on the wall, and I then sat there in horror as they explained to me this man had been for years nutting on his walls and playing with it. And the gel was in fact old seed, and the fumes were the pungent smell of this man's nut room. My freaking God. Story 2. Not a cop, but a former corrections officer. Doing a cell search one time and stumbled across a 500 milliliter Coffee Mate container almost full of accumulated seed. I was later told it took 7 months to save it up. I've seen and dealt with a lot of crap, but for some reason, that one ranks up there. How? How are we 2 stories in and it's already 2 stories about the same sort of deal? I swear, if this third one is also... I'm gonna lose it. Story 3. My brother's a cop. He told me about this time when they responded to a workplace accident where a rail yard worker had been crushed between 2 rail cars. The guy had been crushed/pressed into the ladder of one of the cars. They kept hearing voices coming from the body, muffled voices but definitely coming from the body. It took them a while to figure out the worker had been carrying a radio. Needless to say, they were a bit disturbed until they reached that conclusion. Story 4. My dad answered a domestic call at an apartment on the 23rd floor. As soon as he walked in, he saw blood everywhere, in pools on the floor, spatter on the walls and ceiling, smeared all over everything. He walked further in to find a woman crumpled on the floor, battered beyond recognition, and the partner standing in front of an open window. My dad started to talk to the man, to coax him into coming with. The man immediately turned around and stepped out the window, falling 70 meters to his death. Edit. Yes, she survived. Story 5. Tiny, quiet southern town. Whole family who had been dead for a week. Their teenage daughter's boyfriend, whom she met online, was visiting from across the country. Stepdad, mother, daughter, and her friend all murdered and hacked up by an axe. The mom was a professor at my university a block away, and when she didn't show up to work for a few days, cops went to her house and talked to murderer, who gave them some plausible excuse, so they left. He stayed in the house for a full week before leaving. The cops went back and neighbors reported the smell. They caught the guy at the airport about to fly home. Story 6. A teacher in my little town of 35,000 souls was caught fiddling little boys. In his house, the police found a fully kitted, soundproofed abduction room, luckily unused. The room was windowless, soundproofed, with fresh air ducts, reinforced lockable door, and was stocked with toys, a TV, a bed, and a porta potty, and surveillance equipment. This room was discovered when the dude was arrested and convicted of an old fiddling case from a few years back. Story 7. Brother-in-law is a cop. He told me about a time he and his partner were called to do a wellness check on someone with a terminal illness. Family didn't know where he was, so they get to the house, knock, and no response. They entered the house to see if he had passed away due to his illness. They didn't find him there. What they did find was a stairway leading down to a basement. In that basement was a vast number of intimate toys, ropes, harnesses, etc. There was also a stage with a bed on it, and a video camera on a tripod focused on it. He had stumbled upon this guy's banging dungeon. The guy ended up being alive, but was visiting someone out of town and didn't notify any of his family. Well, if there's ever a reason to notify your family about going away, that would be one of them. This poor man probably felt so much shame. Either that, or he's like, well, I've got nothing left to lose. Sorry, maybe that was a bit dark. Genuinely, my heart does go out to him and his family. But man, that must have been embarrassing. Story 8. My very first dead guy had been in his house for almost a week during a very hot July with no AC. Did you know that your skin will become clear and you can see everything? He popped when the funeral home came to get him. Yes, popped. Some people, they're not bothered by this. Me? No, 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 no. I don't have the stomach. This is the only part of the job that bothers me. Story 10. Friend of a copier. He told me about how him and his buddy went to search an apartment. They looked around and his buddy finally called him over. A guy was just in an oven. Dead, of course, but in an oven. When the guys tried to pull him out of the oven, all the contents and gas of the dead guy fell right out. A few of the guys vomited and gagged. Story 11. My mother used to work for a police department, and I'd hang out there when I would be homesick from school. This old man used to walk to the gas station on the corner to get a pack of smokes and coffee every day. The gas station attendant called for a wellness check when she realized she hadn't seen him for a couple of weeks in the dead of summer. Cops went, knocked, and smelled everything. Opened the door, walked in, immediately came out vomiting from the smell. They had to come back later with respirators, trash bags, and snow shovels to clean up the sludge that used to be the old man. Another officer almost quit his first night on the job. Really bad accident. Guy shows up. The one car has no one in it at all. He's looking around and guy isn't on the ground anywhere. He tried to figure out if maybe the guy walked away, so he goes to look inside for some identification. Finds the guy. He hit so hard that he slammed up under and into the dashboard, and was just a broken sack of bones stuffed in around the steering column and other parts. Story 12. Friend is a cop. Wellness check called in. Went in, smelled horrible, and discovered a large dead guy, shirtless, sitting in his front room in a lawn chair watching TV. He had set up an industrial space heater behind his chair, which was on at full blast. Due to the heat and apparently other factors, he had merged through the back of that lawn chair. This thread went from creepiest to grossest. Well, I was going to say real fast, but no, immediately. There's been like one or two creepy ones, but it's just so gross. Not exactly what I expected in this thread. Story 13. My aunt is a police dispatcher. Normally, she takes calls from the public and has an officer nearby to respond. But one day, she was asked to work the station's radio because the normal guy was sick. That meant she was acting as the central hub of the police radio network, taking calls from officers in the field and issuing backup to them, that kind of thing. She wound up having to listen to 4 cops talking back and forth in a panic as 2 squad cars arrived to check on a reported murder. The person who called was certain there were multiple murderers present. The victim's meat had been cut into 1-inch cubes, as if their murderer was going to fry them up or make kebabs. The whole corpse had been disassembled like that. Bones cut into neat inch segments, organs removed, separated, organized. She remembers one of the officers panicked and screamed something along the lines of, "This is OCD movie monster bullcrap." I can't remember the exact quote, sadly, and I doubt my aunt remembers it herself. She thought they were playing a joke on her until they called for a hazmat crew to get the body. Story 14. My uncle is a cop and likes to tell the story of the time he showed up to arrest a 15-year-old who skipped school to throw rocks through some cars and steal things in them. He gets in there and knows the kid. They've gotten him a few times from the school with the drugs, one time for having a knife. They knock on the door and his 18-year-old brother and 17-year-old sister open it. Cops say what they want, and they tell them to screw off. Cops show they have the warrant for the kid's arrest and they have to open the door. Got told another time, and now the other cop car pulls up and asks what's going on. Uncle said they might have to force their way in and break the chain. 18-year-old craphead says he's got a gun. About 3 seconds later, the door is broken. 18-year-old craphead is tased. 17-year-old is screaming for the brother who wants to book it. He jumps out of the window and gets away, for now. Brother is thrown in cop car. 17-year-old slaps the one officer, gets the same free ride and bracelets. They call the property manager and get permission to enter the house completely to investigate. The second floor reeks. Worst smell they've ever smelled. They get upstairs and it just gets worse and worse. They open the door and find a long, rotten body surrounded by needles and other drug crap. They leave and call it in. Uncle said later it came out that their grandmother died of an overdose. The mother was in jail for stabbing a UPS guy, and the kids never reported the grandmother was dead so they could keep cashing her social security checks. She was dead for about a year. Other than that, his best creepy stories were a guy who tortures and murders animals by feeding them to other animals. Not mouse to snake, think more cat to dog, or way too large rabbit to a starved snapping turtle. He also nailed several live rodents and cats to a board in the basement where he'd photograph them. And the other is a drug dealer who murdered a guy and tried to put him through a meat grinder to feed his pit bull. Story 15. I volunteer with the local PD, and I go on ride-alongs often. My creepy thing isn't scary so much as freaky. So we get a call about some squatters in a house that's going to be demolished soon to make room for a freeway. No big deal. Kick them out, go on with our business. It's sunset, just starting to get dark. Our car and the other officer arrive at this place and it's all fenced off and looks abandoned. And by abandoned, I mean it looks scary as hell. It was an old schoolhouse. Metal swing set, a friendly scarecrow next to a fence, some crosses here and there, but it was in a residential neighborhood. On the blocked-in windows, people wrote in Sharpie all kinds of spooky stuff. "This place belongs to us." and just all around weird crap, like even creepier than that. So there was a main house, a garage type thing, and then a cellar. A freaking door leading underground with creaky wooden steps. And so if you walk down those, it's concrete and there are windows, but it's a basement. The windows just show dirt. There are beds and stuff, but it looks like it's been abandoned for a long time. It was so scary, it's ridiculous. Story 16. Trooper here. Responded to a fight between two brothers and another unrelated black male. All these guys were in their late 30s, early 40s. Got them separated, they were all drunk. Turns out the bigger of the two brothers and the other male were fighting over who got to bang the other brother. They had been assaulting him for a while. All three were low functioning. Not really creepy, but I'll always remember that one. Story 17. Creepiest. A dead guy. But not just your average dead guy. This guy died on his couch, surrounded by no less than 1,500 Miller Lite cans. Plus, he had no friends or family. None. He was retired and his electric bill was auto-deducted from his checking account. He died on his couch and no one realized it for 5 months. When we found him, the top, front really because he was on his back, was completely skeletonized. But the bottom, or back against the couch, was still meaty and rotting. The half-skeleton was kinda creepy. But it's really creepy and sad that this guy left this world, and it didn't affect anyone. Just gone and forgotten. Funniest. Response to a burglary. Going through the house with the homeowners, a young married couple, documenting damage and loss. Step into the bedroom. There's a red vibe on the floor. They look at it, I look at it, and we look at each other. Spend the next 5 minutes with locked eye contact, talking about the broken window, missing jewelry, missing TV, etc. Everyone refusing to look at, discuss, or acknowledge the vibe. And then on to the living room. Oh, also the dead fat lady with the pug that started eating her. OP, why would you not throw that also after the creepiest, not after the funniest? The whiplash I received was unbelievable. But I will say I appreciate the funny story because I have a feeling this thread is not going to have a ton of those. Story 18. We went to an apartment which was a local drug den. A female we knew called and said the male renter had been assaulted and she had run. We got there and the door was bolted shut. I kicked the door over and over again and it wouldn't open. What I found out later is the dope team had done a search warrant on the apartment a couple weeks earlier, and afterward the tenants had reinforced the door jamb with a metal plate. It took me a total of 22 times kicking the door before I broke the deadbolt in half, which flew across the room and hit the wall. We made entry, guns drawn, and started clearing the apartment. This place was the kind of spooky I've only seen in places where a lot of drugs are done. It was dark, there were swastikas, 666, upside-down pentagrams, etc. painted on the walls. Pictures of faces hung on the wall with the eyes X'd out, and baby dolls with their eyes scratched out into X's. As we cleared the first room, we started seeing the blood. First on the bed, then a trail on the floor leading into the back room. The layout was weird. One main room, then a back room which was more of a hallway, and a bathroom at the end of the hall. We followed the trail of blood down the hall to the bathroom door. In front of the door was the renter's dog, which was shaking uncontrollably and peeing all over the floor, scared out of its mind. As we got closer, the dog got really aggressive because, well, it was scared. I made my way around the dog and entered the bathroom where I found the renter hunched over in the shower, bleeding from his face, holding his cheeks with his hands. He was frantically trying to talk, pleading with us to not hurt his dog. Blood was dripping from his mouth and I couldn't understand him. Then I saw the extent of what had happened to him. His jaw had been dislocated on both sides when he was beat by 2 men with a hammer, and it was just hanging there. As he was trying to plead with us, he could only attempt to talk by flicking his blood-covered tongue in the pattern of the words because his jaw didn't work at all. Story 19. Not a cop, but a fire investigator. We were working a scene where 2 kids had died after a space heater caught on fire, and the dad was playing poker down the street, and the mom was with some other man down the street. The fire department came in and cleaned out the scene, and we came in after. As we were sifting through the ashes to find components to the space heater, we found the 2-year-old's foot. Mind you, this was after dark, so we could barely see and were using flashlights. It was a bit creepy. Story 20. Taking this law class. My professor brings in a cop to talk about points of law. At one point, the cop shows the class a picture of a man who took his own life by gun. "Can you see what color his eyes are?" he asked. Of course, no one can, and some dumb stares later, the cop says, "Blue. One blue this way, the other blue that way." The whole class groans, and I raised my hand. Obviously, you have thicker skin about this sort of thing than we do. Have you ever seen anything that has got to you? The cop got serious looking and then told us this story. A local family, 2 brothers, both young. Every Saturday morning, the older brother would get up early and make toast, and both he and his younger brother would sit in front of the TV, munch toast, and watch Saturday morning cartoons. This one Saturday, the older brother didn't want to get up and make toast, so the younger brother decided to try it himself. He apparently went into the kitchen, put the bread in, and pulled the switch down. He didn't notice how close the toaster was to the kitchen window curtains. To make a long story short, the house caught fire, and the parents barely made it out alive with the oldest son. By the time the police officer arrived, the younger boy was dead, burned to death in the living room. The officer said he must have set up the toaster and went into the living room to watch TV and wait for his older brother to wake up and join him. The officer said the window nearby had collapsed from the heat and melted around the little boy. The cop said he had 2 boys about their age at that time, said he had to excuse himself from the scene, went to his squad car and couldn't stop crying and shaking. As the cop told the story in class, he started crying again. Story 21. Dude had 3 years worth of videos he took of boys and men of all ages using the public library bathroom. He said it was common for guys to go in there and pleasure themselves. I had no idea. He said most people had no idea they were being recorded, others knew and just didn't care. He also had 2 external hard drives full of every kind of twisted adult content imaginable. Story 22. Funny and irrelevant story. My cousin is a cop and a little on the short side. Minimum requirements for a New Zealand police officer. During a search of a house, he was using a 20-liter paint container to stand on to assist in searching higher areas of the house, closets and such. At the completion of the search and after 3 hours, they'd found nothing. My cousin then looked in the paint container he was using the whole time to stand on, thinking it would be full of paint, you know? Instead, it was full of weed. About 20 kilograms. Laughter ensued. Edit. Yes, thanks to all those who pointed out the New Zealand police have no height restrictions. They have no height restrictions anymore. They used to. Years ago when my cousin and I applied. Story 23. This one wasn't mine, but from an EMT friend. It's also maybe not so much creepy as nasty, but it makes my hair stand on end whenever I think of it. In one of the apartments in a nearby city, the apartment manager went in to investigate a really bad smell in one of the lower units. Apparently, people all around were complaining. Once he saw what was up, he called the ambulance. So the first responders show up, which includes said EMT friend. And there's a lady sitting on the couch. There's also something squirmy going on down below in her underpants area. So they check her out and in the process remove said undergarments. Out falls a swarm of bugs. Yes, her lady bits were covered in them. Apparently said individual had a fairly strong substance abuse problem. Some of the needles she poked into her nethers, which caused an infection. This led to rotting flesh, which attracted flies, which in turn led to bugs. The worst part, she wasn't dead. Just so drugged up she basically never noticed that she was literally rotting and falling apart from the waist down. Story 24. This one is from an MP friend of mine, so take it with a grain of salt. My buddy was duty officer one night and as such he had to respond to serious events. One night there was a fire alarm and he and a bunch of MPs rolled on it. This was a real fire. False alarms are pretty common. The source turned out to be an officer's apartment and the officer. When the investigation was conducted, it was found that the officer had filled a bathtub with fuel and field manuals and decided to take his own life by sitting in the tub and igniting the fuel. After a few seconds, he decided this was a bad idea and ran from the tub to his apartment door before death finally took him. So the responding MPs found his charred remains and the bits of burning flesh that were still falling off of him as he ran for the door. Story 25. I spent my first year as a constable in an inner-city suburb of Queensland. Now, of the population of this area, something like 40% was reserved for government-commissioned housing for rehabilitated criminals and persons released from mental health assessment centers. So there was a share of creepy crap. But to be fair, for the most part, the people we dealt with were more like cartoon characters than super shady creeps, but they had their moments. One guy that we'd met before just decided one afternoon to start destroying crap in the commission set of units he lived at. He was freaking going off. Kicking through latticing, throwing pot plants off of buildings at passerbys, stealing and collecting people's shoes, smashing car windows. After about 15 minutes of mayhem, he must have ran out of steam and gone back to his unit. That's where we found him. But he just would not stop screaming and bashing his head and face into any surface or object he could find. Eventually, we got a van with a pod and secured him. Then we went back into the house to figure out what the hell had happened. The house is a mess. Somehow he had fit 2 Coles trolleys inside and was using them as furniture. The whole place smelled of rotting food and crap. On the coffee table, if you can call it that, are a series of scrawled notes of just expletives. Again, not massive mental function with this guy, and a wooden box. Inside the wooden box was about 100 small clip seal bags. Over half the bags had a brown, granular organic material in them. The others had clear crystal-like stuff in them. The brown bags were somewhat organized from smallest to largest staples. Now, with the type of people we had in the area, we had all sorts of wonderful ways these people got high. We were used to seeing weird crap that people would ingest. So we don't recognize these bags, but we've got a pretty good idea it's a narcotic of some kind. So of course we examine the bags and their contents. There's enough there to test if need be, so I get one of the bags and empty the contents to see it better. So the samples of brown material, they've got flecks of color and little tendril-like hairs, Not unusual for a plant derivative to have, but I've never seen it before. So I'm looking at it as I talk to my partner, saying it might be really coarse hash derivative or a byproduct of production of something else. Might explain why this guy went nuts. A dog unit officer who arrested with the assist comes in. He sees the scene, looks at the coffee table, looks at the bags, looks at me holding the contents of one in the palm of my hand, and straight away says, "That guy's got golden staph. He's been collecting scabs." This guy had been picking at a golden staph infection on his leg, collecting the scabs, organizing them into smallest to largest, and then eating them. The small yellow crystals, snot and crust from his nose. Same end goal. Well, could have gone my whole life without reading that one. I would love to stop here, but nope, gotta keep going. Gotta soldier through. Ugh. Story 26. Hoarder's house last spring. Go in and there's maybe 5 inches of dust everywhere, and clothes all over and mail from 1999. There was a small walkway cleared through the house, just enough to walk around. I walk into the bathroom and there are turds floating in the toilet and the water is spinning, so there's just a whirlpool of turds. Story 27. Less creepy, but more of a surprise. Got a call for a burglary. I'm doing a walkthrough with the resident, noting all the missing and damaged property. He was an older guy. We're in the bedroom looking in drawers. I open one and see it full of women's panties and bras. I ask him when his wife will be home to help identify missing items, and he stutters a bit and finally just says that they're his. I closed the drawer and went on with my investigation. We're all a little weird, bro. Far be it from me to judge you for wearing pretty underwear. Story 28. Not a cop, but I worked alongside Adult Protective Services and sometimes cops. The place smelled absolutely dreadful. The elderly lady was dead, sitting upright on the couch. She had crapped herself a watery one at that time of death, apparently. That's not the only thing that smelled bad. There were buckets of crap, literally dozens of buckets filled with fecal matter in every room of the house. One of the cops didn't have a face mask, and he almost puked every time he coughed or sneezed because of all the dust and the putrid smell. Apparently, the elderly lady lived in the home with a few of her brothers. Some homeless people that were squatting in the backyard were the ones that called the police because they saw the brothers leave, but hadn't seen the lady in days. The smell coming from the house also raised some red flags. Story 29. Not a cop, but my brother is an EMT that told me these 2 stories. Cops got called because some children were wandering around in the yard of a house in the evening. Neighbors had never seen those children, and there were no parents or other people. No lights on in the house or any signs of somebody being home. The children weren't wearing any clothes. They approached the kids. The children are 6 to 10 years old, but they talk in an indistinguishable language or basically gibberish. Cops call for backup and ambulance because this gets freaky. They take care of the kids outside. Nobody knows what the kids are saying. They're very pale, like they've never been in the sun. Cops enter the house, no electricity. It's dark, so they use their flashlights. House seems to be used, yet is cluttered and not well taken care of. They look around and find a crib with something laying in it. No sound, no movement. Crap. One of the cops goes outside, can't handle it. Other officers walk over and, relief, it's just a doll. Real bad case of neglect. Parents apparently left for the day and forgot to lock up the kids. Another story. Cops got called to a house. They enter and look around. They walk around the house and check the cellar. They find rooms with doors similar to prison cells. Kids inside. They talk, but can't see, because there was no light in their cells. Their eyes didn't develop properly. Because my brother is just an EMT, he doesn't know the end of the story, but this freaked everyone out. Story 30. Not a cop, but a former officer of the law told me this years ago. I'll let you decide if he's full of crap or not. The officer had responded to a parent's call to arrest their son, whom they were convinced had relapsed on drugs. What had tipped them off was when the son had started blasting both thrash metal and adult content on max volume from his bedroom and locked himself in. Communication with the kid was impossible with the noise. However, the officer's partner had been able to glance into the kid's window and could see he was sitting motionless in front of his computer. He was shirtless, but otherwise everything seemed normal. With permission from the parents, the officers decided to push through the lock. Moans and groans and relentless guitar deafened the ears. The only light illuminating the room was the bluish hue of the computer monitor. The kid's face was a distorted grin, stretching to his lips' furthest limits. He wasn't shirtless. He was in fact naked and drenched in sweat, and in his right hand, cupped like a chalice, were his balls, which he had ripped off in a flurry of drug-induced self-mutilation. Story 31. Australian here. Worked remote enough for some good stories. Late at night, called to a drunken dispute where a firearm had been discharged. Attended with 4 or 5 of us, the whole patrol group. Found the gun, which was good. My partner went to unload it and realized it had no trigger. He went to touch the safety and paused. We both had a closer look and then asked the owners. Apparently the safety was the trigger. Anyway, no one was licensed, so we searched the house for extra ammo or other weapons. No one is really supposed to have guns here unless you have a good reason. Don't know why I did it. It was a dumb idea given the state of the house and the area. Dog poop in the floor and stuff, nappies everywhere. I opened the fridge, staring face to face with a kangaroo with its paws out looking at me. That was the top shelf. I looked down one shelf and there was the other half of the kangaroo, tail hanging down off the middle shelf. The smell. Oh dear, the smell. The light was on. Not sure if the fridge actually worked though. Closed the door pretty fast. Of course, the most reasonable thing to do was to move on to another part of the room and yell at my partner to check the fridge. Not really creepy, just unusual. I was newish at the time. Story 32. My dad was a state cop. Yeah, shut up. It counts. He responded to a call in a rural area once. The couple involved were known repeat domestic violence/battery offenders. This time, the lady apparently had had enough and either shot the guy in self-defense or shot him point blank. When my dad entered the trailer, he told me you could see a thick of dark muck on the floor. Some spots were more splattered/thicker than others, but it was clearly a trail, as if something had been dragged. My dad and his partner followed the slick through the front room where the man had been shot. It crept down the hallway and into the kitchen, where they saw the man himself. He had dragged himself bleeding from the chest/stomach through his house, trying to reach a phone. He made it into the kitchen, where he managed to hook his chin onto a table, so his chin was still on the tabletop, and his body kind of drooped under him with his legs kicked out behind him. Story 33. Had a buddy I worked with as a retired officer. He was driving past and saw a multi-car roll over on the interstate, so he calls the ambulance and starts to look for people who got ejected from the cars. Found all the passengers but one. Most of the people lost their lives. Finally, the ambulance and a fire truck come, and he's trying to find the last person. Turns out it was a little girl and she was face down in the asphalt, but still moving weakly. He went to go get her when the fire truck ran over her head. Scarred him for life, he said. Story 34. Former LEO with 2 stories. Got dispatched to a call. Daughter has tried to reach her elderly mom and can't make contact. These usually end badly. Made location at the house and received written authorization from daughter to make forced entry at the front door. Asked the daughter to wait by the squad car and had fire department spread the door frame open. Immediately noticed the smell and began to search the house. Found the mom in the kitchen laying on open door of the oven. Half of her face and hair were burnt off and the oven was still on, cooking her. Apparently we found out from the daughter the mother used the oven for heat and had had a heart attack and fell on the oven door. Best thing I can say is it looked like Harvey Dent from the Nolan Batman film. Second story. Got a call from dispatch about a woman screaming from an abandoned apartment, saying she was being tortured or murdered. My partner, 4 other officers, and I had to search every room and door in what looked like a college dorm. All the doors faced inward and there was absolutely no way of knowing where the screaming was coming from. Partner found the woman covered in her own blood running out of an apartment. I held apartment door while he ran her down. Scariest call of my life. Turns out she was tripping and had been cutting herself. There was no way of knowing that until we searched the apartment. I swear that Michael Myers, Krueger, Chucky was waiting behind every door in that apartment waiting to stab me. Awesome time. Story 35. Abandoned houses are pretty depressing. Family pictures and albums collecting dust and decaying. Sad stuff written in marker as daily reminders to start again, get off drugs, look for work, make things right. All written in Spanish, and seeing a sleeping mat comprised of towels and old sweaters in a corner, and pizza boxes from Little Caesars next to it. Lots of stuff you see tells a story you never asked for or expected to find. Makes me feel lucky to have what I have. I don't know what it is, but this story so far for me feels like the creepiest. It's just so hauntingly succinct. It is a perfect description of a place where life was had and is no longer. And something about that, to me at least, is profoundly creepy. Story 36. Some guys were four-wheeling at a local lake in an old topless Ford Bronco with no windshield. It rolled and threw everyone out but the driver. It was remote and took us a while to get there. When I arrived, everyone that could move was kneeled against the Bronco. When I walked up to it, I could hear screams coming from underneath. It was agonizing, those screams. I shined my flashlight underneath and I could see the guy's face. His head was so deformed from the weight of the vehicle and he was still alive, just screaming. FD was still a few minutes out and we didn't have anything to lift it off him. The kneeling people were apparently trying to lift it off. Then they reverted to digging. It was horrible. Such a helpless feeling for what seemed like eternity. The screaming eventually became low moans that eventually stopped. The guy passed away before we could get him out. This was my first year as an officer. Later that night, early morning, I had to go tell his wife about his passing. It was really hard not to break down crying with her. She wanted to know more details, and all I could think of was the screaming. I'm not sure if she ever learned the horrible details we encountered that night, but I didn't tell her. Those screams woke me up many nights for years after. Eventually, they get replaced with new tragedies. Story 37. My dad is part of CSI and tells me odd stories every day as he comes home. A heavily obese hoarder was living in her apartment, everything filled head to toe with rotting food, wrappers, and pee. She held the common decency to use her crap-covered toilet and did so, but on that particular day it wasn't just a good old number 2, it was also a baby that had been rotting inside of her for months. The poor creature fell out of her in chunks and its limbs just kind of exploded all around the toilet. A nice baby soup that had to be fished out of a toilet by 2 officers and seemed to have them shaken up for a day. Story 38. Not me, but a friend. He and his partner were at the time working in a smallish town, so most calls were regarding people taking their own lives or elderly people. This day they check up on an apartment of an elderly which they presume is dead due to the horrible smell. In cases like this, they would take turns in who would be the one to go in to check on things, and this time it was my friend's partner. 5 minutes after going in, he comes out with a shocked look on his face, completely wet and covered in all kinds of nasty fluids. When he went in, it had been completely dark, so he probed around trying to find a light. Suddenly, he slips in a pool of something, and when he landed, he knew the worst had happened. He slipped in fluids of a corpse and landed in it, so to say, getting submerged in a completely rotting human corpse. Bad day at work, I'd say. Story 39. Not a cop, but a friend of a cop. My buddy's the sheriff, even though it's of a very safe small town. He still takes his job seriously and has done a lot for the community. Nothing bad happened to the community until he had to investigate a double homicide. One mother and her child shot by their divorced father/husband. My buddy's daughter had to photograph the body, and she couldn't forget about it, and she tried to take her own life months later. Story 40. Dead bodies, especially hanging bodies, are always creepy finds. Found some guy's hate room, a back room in a trailer with a red light full of knives and holes in the paneling. It's not uncommon to walk into a house with weapons, but there was one dude I remember who had motion detectors and cameras in his yard, as well as a hunting or sniper rifle at every window of the house. There was another warrant served on a dispatcher at a local agency. He was found in his house with no utilities, several female wigs, and a piece of raw meat in his bed that he'd been sticking his dong in. I guess what made it creepy is the dude seemed odd, but not crazy as a crap house rat. Story 41. This may be a bit off the post, but my friend is an officer. They got a call one night from a 4-year-old that dad was hurt. When they got to said address, the small child answered the door. As they head inside, they hear a woman calling out in here. They approached the bedroom to find Mom tied to the bed, dressed as scantily clad Wonder Woman. Dad is knocked out cold as Superman. Apparently Dad jumped on the bed, forgot about the ceiling fan, and knocked himself out cold. My friend said it was the funniest, craziest thing he ever saw. Woman had to scream to wake up the child to call the cops. Story 42. I would have to say the creepiest thing I found happened during a welfare check on an elderly woman in Phoenix, Arizona during the hottest summer ever. The callers were concerned about an elderly neighbor who was a major hoarder. When I arrived, I was able to smell this horrible stench from her rotting body. Never did know the COD, but always stuck with me. Story 44. When I was a weird teenager, I had this strange thing that I would just take night walks in areas with no lights. Mostly forced walking paths. My logic then was facing fears and feeling awesome after. On one night it was pitch black, couldn't really see far. Just doing my thing and I bumped into someone else. Saw him at the very last moment. I just screamed and started running back only to hear him chasing me. I could hear the sound of his footsteps. Then after a while they became more distant. I did a Forrest Gump and just kept running. Never went for a night forest walk again. Thinking back, my guess would be that he was some sort of forest ranger or something. Back then, I figured I was gonna get murdered. Story 45. In keeping with the question and not venturing into storyland with things that have occurred outside houses, homeless man died inside a vacant house in July. Had been there about 2 weeks before someone found him. Bugs crawling inside his mouth and eyes, extremely bloated. He popped when the FD went to move it. They had on full SCBA gear. It was awful. Lady died inside of her house and wasn't found for a week or so. Her dog had started chewing her left foot off in hunger. Guy died inside of his house and had no family checking on him. He was there about 6 months before we found him. He looked like a mummy, actually. And all of the thoughtful ways people have taken their lives. putting up tarps before blowing your brains out, or the one guy that lived in a studio apartment above a popular restaurant. He removed part of his ceiling to get to a crossbeam to hang himself. He cleaned up the mess, vacuumed, did his dishes, made his bed, laid out various piles of cash/property, and each had a handwritten note for the recipient, turned on some music, and hung himself. And my personal favorite, a vacant mansion in town was owned by a rich family, and it kept getting burglarized. My zone partner, female, and I, male, would occasionally go inside the house and do a walkthrough to make sure no one was inside. We decided to do the whole house one night instead of just the first 2 floors. Went up to the attic and found boxes of adult content magazines and books. Mostly vanilla stuff, but there was one book. I don't know what it was called. We flipped to a random page. A lady was pleasuring a guy with the bend of her arm, like where the elbow is. Turn the page, the guy is literally screwing her armpit. Couple pages later, the guy has moved south, but he skipped over the Honey Hole and the Hershey Highway and was now banging the bend in her knee. I looked at my partner. We were both very good friends and both married, and I said, I wonder what that feels like. And she looked at me and smiled and said, why don't you try it and find out for yourself? That was not an invitation, apparently. Story 46. Oh, Christ. So we get a call to do a welfare check. Someone called the station house because they haven't heard from their mom, and could we pretty please swing by to check on her? Fine. We get to the apartment building, knock on the door, and when there's inevitably no answer, we grab the super to open the door for us. The first sign that things were going terribly wrong was that the chain was still on the door. The second was the god-awful stench coming from the place that told us something was dead inside. As before, it's dark in there, and none of the lights worked because they'd burned out in the time the poor lady was sitting there. We found her on the couch, positive Q sign. Hang your tongue out of your mouth like you're dead, and you get the idea. And it smelled of the beginning stages of decomposition. So it's the DOA, the cops in the living room, and the super standing in the doorway of this dark apartment, and we obviously have our flashlights trained in on the guest of honor. At this point, the dead person raises a hand to her eyes in a very zombie-like fashion and says, yeah, exactly like that. So totally a zombie, right? Having seen enough, we, again, run out of there like we've seen, a ghost. The super, who's not privy to the rise of the living dead, sees 2 6'3" cops thundering down the hallway at him and figures it's his cue to get moving too. Sadly for him, we overtake him and his stubby little legs and leave him to be dined up by the zombie. Survival of the fittest and all, right? We got down to the next flight before we figured out that even if it was a zombie, it was an old lady one and we could probably kick its butt. We went back into the apartment and called an ambulance for her, and she apparently had a stroke alone in the apartment and sat there for a few days. The hand and vocalizations were really what was left of her brain responding to stimulus. Went by the hospital the next day before work, but she was too gone. Story 47. Not a cop, but my dad used to be one a while back. He told me about a time he had a call to domestic violence. If I remember right, the boyfriend was abusing his girlfriend, and somehow it came down to self-defense. The girl shot him and ended him. I guess they still had their guns out when the body twitched and scared the crap out of my dad's partner. He almost shot the guy on reflex. After that, they found his driver's license and discovered it was his birthday. So they sang happy birthday to a dead guy. My dad has a lot more stories, and that wasn't even the most screwed up one, but it came to mind first. Story 48. A guy I worked with for a few weeks was out on bail for hitting and murdering his girlfriend with his car. They didn't know if it was him for sure, so he was out until the trial. It later came to light it was him. When he didn't show up for some court appearance, the cops were sent to find him and found a dead body in his living room. Apparently, the dead person had found out he did in fact murder his girlfriend with his car and was going to testify against him. So, he murdered him. Edit. I was super out of this when I wrote this, so I'm going to copy a summary that someone else wrote. You worked with the guy for a few weeks, I'm going to call him Chad. Chad was charged with hitting and murdering his girlfriend, Sally, but was out on bail. When Chad didn't show up for a court appearance, the cops went to Chad's house and found a dead body, but not Chad. Apparently, this other guy, Bernie, found out that Chad murdered Sally, and Bernie was going to testify, so Chad murdered him, and then absconded to parts unknown. Except the guy Chad was very quickly arrested. Story 49. At the time, I wasn't a cop, but a volunteer firefighter. I can't remember what brought us to this particular house, but when we got there, the family was waiting outside. Typical family with a very awkward teenage son who didn't make eye contact and seemed a bit unfriendly. I went down to the basement where I came across hundreds of 2-liter soda bottles, uncapped, full of dip spit, and a pile about waist high of crusty-looking tube socks, piled up around what I could only assume was the awkward teenage son's station. The smell that about 200 liters of dip spit and dried up baby batter produces is pretty gross. Something also tells me this kid was probably a Redditor, so if you see this, clean up your parents' basement. Not necessarily creepy, but once again, disgusting. Why does this keep happening? How have there been so many stories like this? Surely this can't be that common, right? Story 50. A friend of mine was in the FBI. They arrested some guy for massive amounts of child content. Someone has to watch the videos and look at the pictures. The videos have to be watched frame by frame and document any possible evidence. If the kids in the videos aren't known, then they have to try to identify the kids. After 3 12-hour days, he asked his supervisor if he could take a couple days away from it. They told him no, and he quit. Story 51. Sergeant at my law enforcement school told us that a landlord once called them to investigate an apartment room for a reason. As my instructor went in with her partner, they discovered a lonely lady had died, but no one knew about her, so no one checked. Her corpse was decomposing for such a long time. She started to seep through the ceiling and into another apartment room. She had other stories, but this was the quickest type. Story 52. Friend of cop here. He told me of someone taking their own life that he'd been called to. Was first on the scene. The whole thing took place in a park bathroom, ended up being a murder, self-unalive. A man had taken an escort to the bathroom, stabbed her to death and removed what he could of her butt with the knife, then shot himself. He said it also appeared the woman might have had bite marks in and around her lower regions. Story 53. So I heard this one from Dad, and it's like 2 stories in one. My dad worked for a restoration company, and they had a contract with the city for first response to certain emergencies. The cops were called to do a welfare check on a woman. The family hadn't heard from her in a week or so. When they got there, they could see her lying on the ground by the front door through the window. They ended up breaking down the back door to get in, and she was long gone. So they called the restoration company to come board up the broken back door. My dad arrived on scene before they removed the body. She was all bloated and nasty. My dad, never having seen a dead body except at a funeral, was a bit disturbed. The chief of the fire department was there and asked him if he was doing okay and if it was his first body. My dad was like, yeah. The fire chief didn't seem bothered at all, so my dad asked him what was the worst he's seen. He had 3 stories, and this was in my opinion the most disturbing. The scene. Apparently bystanders had seen a guy on his cell phone and he was clearly arguing with someone. He hung up abruptly and threw his phone on the ground in anger, then walked out to the highway. I'm not sure the exact road setup. A 17-wheel semi was driving up and he jumped out in front of it. The driver tried to stop but couldn't. Every single wheel ran over him. When the fire chief got there, he said there were body parts and little pieces everywhere. The chief thought there was no way someone could survive that. He walked up to the majority of the body and heard noises? Apparently the guy was still breathing. Then after a moment he stopped. Immediately the chief goes in to start for CPR. As soon as he touched the man's face, the whole head caved in like a rotting pumpkin. Story 54. Back when I was in training, I had a call for service where these people didn't want to go in their house because they thought it was haunted. They weren't explicitly saying the word haunted, but heavily implied. They said the last straw was when they went to go to the bathroom and saw glowing green handprints all over their bathroom walls. Okay, sure, I'll check it out for you. I go into the bathroom and sure enough, there were freaking glowing handprints all over the walls. My training officer and I noped out of there pretty fast. Sketchy house. This isn't my creepiest call as far as dead bodies and such go, but it was the only one that was related to paranormal creepy rather than regular old creepy. Yep, I definitely can't say that wouldn't freak me the hell out too. Like I'm sure there is some explanation for it, but if people are saying their house was haunted for the longest time, and you're just like, yeah, sure, whatever, and then you go check it out, and there's green handprints on the walls, you're like, okay, yeah, my bad, actually. Story 55. I'm no longer a cop, but it wasn't because of this scene that I left the profession. Got a call from a wife that her husband had died / taken his own life in their backyard shed. I was the first on the scene, and she directed me towards the backyard and told me that the door to the shed was around on the side. I walked around to the side of the building and saw a guy in full French-made attire hanging by the neck. The garage ended up being a super kinky dungeon filled with leather, whips, machines, weird pics on the walls, and buckets of, liquid? The best part was that the whole place was wired for video and sound. It ended up being a case of autoerotic asphyxiation gone wrong, and his wife was mortified that the whole dungeon thing had gotten out. Story 56. Not a cop, but a contractor for cleaning up dead bodies. My high school psych teacher told a story about how he got a call to clean up someone ending their own lives in Louisiana, I believe. He shows up to the house with his partner and gears up in a hazmat suit and heads up to the attic. A man had taken his own life in there a week ago with a crossbow. Upon entering the room, he was hit with a wave of moist, pungent corpse air, and even through the suit it made him retch. This guy sat on a box and held a crossbow out in front of himself and pinned himself to the wall with a bolt through the head. As they started removing the crossbow bolt, his severely bloated body exploded into giant slop, covering both of them in week-old guts. Needless to say, he chose a different career path. Story 57. Not a cop, but EMS. This happened a few months back. I would volunteer with EMS in a town about 20 minutes away from where I live. Pretty small, so it's pretty slow. We get the first call of the day around 10 a.m. I asked the medic what the call was, and he says 44. I asked what that was, since I haven't heard of it before. He says the guy shot himself with a 44. I wasn't sure if I should believe him, since he bullcraps sometimes. We get to the scene, and the PD is already there. The 2 officers and some FD volunteers are there waiting by the door. I walk into the house, and instantly, something doesn't smell right. I look around and notice the guy's a hoarder. I think maybe it's something thrown around that smells. We continue to the bedroom, and there's the guy laying face down, head between his nightstand and his bed. It smelled pretty bad. He had a gash on his head from when he fell, and I'm guessing hit the nightstand. He was 60 years old and pretty unhealthy. The other medics and police said he probably didn't die right away. The guy had been dead for about a week. He was starting to decompose, had bugs on him, and his skin was wet to the touch. Bubbles of water deposits on the outer layer of the skin. They made us check for pulse, so we hooked him up to our monitor, and, well, he had no pulse. I was surprised that they made us check for pulse, like, really? He's as dead as he can be. But they needed a printout for some reason. The smell was similar to dead animal smell, but it lingered, and I would occasionally smell it throughout the day. On my way home, I passed a dead animal, and since I was on my Jeep with no top, I got the smell pretty hard. Almost puked. Story 58. Not a cop, but I know a lot about the case, and I know people who discovered it. In my city, at the Travel Lodge on the main commercial street, a few people who met on some dating site or Craigslist or something ended up ritually taking their own lives inside of one of the rooms. According to the police report, the 2 people who found it weren't the actual cops, but rather the next-door occupants. They heard a commotion and looked out their door, only to find blood coming through the door like it was the freaking Shining. They walked in to investigate and found the mangled bodies of the 2 women who found each other, and the barely living body of the guy who found them both. As he told it, they were supposed to let him murder them both for the glory of Satan or something, then he would take his own life. The crime scene was so gruesome and traumatic that several police officers and paramedics and nurses who treated the guy were all later treated for post-traumatic stress. And the incident has led the way for movement calling for having a PTSD therapy for first responders. Edit. Another story. An Air Force major who, get this, was in charge of the local cadet corps was found with a massive multi-terabyte storage of child content on his computers. I was in cadets for a few years a while back, Army, and the commanding officer of our Air Sister Corps was caught with CP. This guy was a major, and he was in charge of 100 children on a weekly basis. I was told he later hung himself in order to escape prosecution. Funny story, I was on a school field trip and our bus driver wore a bomber jacket with Royal Canadian Air Cadets Corps crest on it. I sparked up a conversation with him, and as it turns out, it was Major Pedo's direct successor. One thing led to another, and we got on the topic about the guy and how the Corps reacted. Believe it or not, but as it turns out, taking over the Air Cadet Corps from someone like that isn't as hard as one would expect, apparently. The cop who found it, coincidentally the mother of one of the Air Cadets in the Corps, called it the most disgusting thing she has ever seen in all her years of service. No wonder that major decided to call it quits. Safe to say it, but my town of 200,000 plus people is quite the little screw-up. Mind you, I haven't even mentioned being the ice and crack and H per capita capital of Ontario. That's a whole nother story. Yep. As far as creepy things go that you could find, a ritual self-sacrifice, some weird, super intense pact thing, that's pretty creepy. Even for someone who isn't even particularly spiritual, I think I would be chilled to the bone. Story 59. Dad is a cop and not exactly a house search, but got a call saying that a certain professor had been missing after not returning home Friday night. Dad and a couple of other officers found the professor hanging in his office dressed in full-blown drag. Apparently, the guy confessed his love to a female professor who rejected him. From what they could gather after she left, he dressed up in drag as the female professor and hung himself. Story 60. We got sent to a well-being check for an old lady that lived by herself in a rough section of the city. This was a few years back, but if I remember correctly, she had no family or friends. Some sort of wellness aide called it in. No one had heard from her in a few days. We knock, announcing ourselves, but nothing. We get a property manager on the phone and he comes by with a key. We open the door and there she is, very dead on the floor. Look of fear/pain frozen on her face. One of her feet was detached and about a meter away from her body, and blood everywhere. I instantly assumed she was murdered and got a shot of adrenaline. But then we take a second and take in the whole scene, and this is how the woman died. She needed to adjust her blinds, so she got a chair from the kitchen, stood up on the chair, lost her balance, fell and landed on her foot, which snapped it clean off her leg. She then proceeded to crawl around bleeding until she passed out and died. I've seen much worse, but that one sticks with me because I can't even imagine the thoughts running through her head as she was dying, all alone and unable to get help. Story 61. I knew a cop that was a part of the team that arrested the Green River murderer. When it was suspected that there were more undiscovered bodies, the cops wanted to see if Gary Ridgway would talk. They put him in a police SUV and drove around the areas he was known to leave bodies at, and basically had small talk and would slide in questioning here or there. I think the cop was saying that they sometimes had a few hits, and then Ridgway started playing games with them, saying stuff like, "Well, I think I hid this woman's body over there, but I'm not really sure. I guess you'll have to go check." The cop also guarded Ridgway's house when it was still under investigation. He ended up feeding the guy's outdoor cat when it arrived in the middle of the night. I've seen enough Criminal Minds to know that, yeah, being up close and personal with someone that unhinged, I mean, just being around them, you'd get weird vibes. Talking to them, literally being toyed with by them? Not a cop, but our campus monitor at school told me the story for an interview for the school paper. When he was a few years into his career, he answered a double homicide call. Kid murdered both of his parents with a 2x4 on Christmas Day. Went and documented the scene and went back on patrol. Later that night, he sees someone walking down the street that matches the suspect description. Stops the guy and asks him basic questions and notices some blood on his sleeves and some gray crap on his watch. Immediately arrests him and realizes what the gray crap was. Suspect looked up at him and straight-faced says, "Got that promotion on this one, huh?" One of the most sobering and dark conversations/stories I've had with someone. Really makes you look at the world differently. Story 63. Guy on my shift got a domestic call on the other side of the county. He responded to the house and found a guy running laps around the yard of the home. The family said in broken English that the guy was possessed and they had called a witch doctor to help out who was on the way. Crazy guy ran up to the officer and got in his face, so the officer detained him by placing him in handcuffs and laying him down on his back on the porch until he could figure out what was going on. While talking with the family, he noticed that the guy was moving. The heels of his feet were on the ground and his body was flat, but his upper body was 3 feet off the ground, and his hands were still cuffed behind him. Dude was levitating. Officer pushed him to the ground, took off the handcuffs, and told the family how they could have him committed and left. Story 64. Not a cop, but doing a roving watch on a US naval base. Basically walking through all the barracks and making sure nobody was breaking the rules. It was a dry base, so no alcohol allowed. Passed by a partially open room door, smells like drunk vomit. Opened the door, saw a male on his bed, vomit on his chest and neck, pooling around his head. Performed as much first response as I was allowed to, but he'd asphyxiated. Choked on his own vomit. He was dead. The creepy part was a sobbing sound coming from underneath him. He was wearing civvies. Looked like he'd been out earlier in the night. Found his phone underneath his shoulder when I tried to clear his airway. It was his fiancée on FaceTime. She listened to him die. That stuck with me more than anything. Story 65. My dad was a cop in a small mountain town. He told us stories. One of the memorable ones was this couple who went hiking in the backwoods miles from civilization. They come across a tree growing over a cliff and notice a body hanging from the tree. Search and rescue show up to recover the dead guy who had been reported missing over a year ago. He had some terminal disease and decided hanging himself in the middle of nowhere off a stunning cliffside view was the way to go. What he didn't consider, however, was after he died, a crow nested in his chest cavity. So for close to a year, he was a hanging corpse birdhouse. Dad said it surprised the coroner too when he took the body off the tree and a family of birds flew out his shirt. Story 66. I once responded to a domestic call where I heard a woman screaming from the apartment above the location, and I went to see what it was. There was no one in the apartment. Also, I had an interaction with a lady who went crazy living with her adult daughter in a house near the precinct. Nothing out of the ordinary there. Then about a year later, I got a call to the same house, only a completely different mother and daughter. Same age group, didn't know the previous tenants. Mothers both claimed there were demons in the home and tried to take their own lives. Strange. Could never explain that. Was that place checked for like gas leaks or something like that? But it's strange that it was only the mothers who went nuts, because from what OP said, the daughter seemed fine. That one is definitely a bit unsettling. One of those things where you're like, yeah, anything can happen, but that's quite the coincidence. Story 67. friend of a cop. Not a house search, but sort of a car search, and not creepy, just funny and unbelievable cop story that I wanted to share. Had a gentleman come into a station to the front desk to report a crime. The said gentleman told the desk sergeant that a man had shortchanged him on his massive weed order and had robbed him of over 200 pounds because of this. I should point out the guy had obviously been smoking it by this point, as he was apparently stinking of weed. Desk sergeant calls my friend in from the back for a second opinion on how to approach the robbery. My friend instantly smells the weed and asks the gentleman if he still had the weed and how much he had. The gentleman replied with, "Yeah man, still got it. He only gave me half the amount I paid for, so I came here." My friend asks where the weed was, only to be told in the boot of his car in the police station car park. My friend asks the gentleman to take him to the car so he could see the weed and judge what offense the robber would be getting pulled up for later on. Said gentleman, of course, leads my friend out to the car, opening his boot to reveal over 400 pounds of weed, followed by major confusion as my friend slaps the cuffs on him. Now, I'm personally of the belief that marijuana has no real reason to be illegal, regulation over criminalization and all that. But man, you gotta have some self-preservation instincts, brother. If it's illegal where you live, you can't be doing this. It was one thing to go into the station and tell them that you had been stiffed in a weed deal gone wrong, but to lead the cop out to your car and show him the weed. Come on, man. You gotta do better than that. Anyway, that was totally not an answer to the question of the thread, but it is our last story. So in my opinion, it's kind of nice ending on a bit of a higher note. There are a lot of really disgusting, mostly, stories in this thread, but thank you for coming along with me for them. And thank you as well for watching. I hope you have a wonderful day or night wherever you are, and I will see you in the next one.